Okay, so we are here today to present Queer a Graphic History, which has been recently released in Italy with Fandango. And we are the three persons who have translated it into Italian. And we are here with Meg-John and Jules Scheele, who is going to draw online while we talk. So we can start with the questions now. And so just a question which is a kind of introduction to. Sorry, we have a lot of noise here.
Flying around. It's a bit full of pigeons at the moment.
Full of pigeons?
Yeah, they're like, cooing and doing funny things.
Oh, I get them too. I've got pigeons on my windowsill. Just you can't see them, but they're just behind. So we've got many pigeons in the recording.
Yeah, this cannot be a coincidence.
Yes.
So we can start with a kind of introductory question for you. So at the beginning of the book, the word queer is defined as a wide umbrella term encompassing all those people who do not identify as either heterosexual or cisgender. So a more comprehensive definition, especially if compared, as you say, to the ever-extending existing acronyms and letters. Do you still, both of you, of course, consider this term to have this inclusive potential today?
Yes, I think so, yes. I mean, I think it is why we try to unpack that at the beginning of the book is people use it in so many different ways still. So for some people, it still just feels like an insult that they heard in the playground, schoolyard, and for other people, queer has a very specific kind of academic or activist meaning. But I think the most common way it's used at the moment is probably as this broad umbrella term that we talked about. And I do think it's really important because that idea of just adding another letter all the time. So at the moment, sort of arguments for adding A for asexual or I for intersex to LGBT. There's so many different non-normative sexualities and genders and relationship styles that we could add. And instead, if we think of queer as an umbrella term for anyone who's outside the normative ways of doing sex, gender and relationships, then that's a helpful, an encompassing term for all of that.
So the second question, how do you feel that the word queer is in practice succeeding in welcoming all the different identities in this historical moment? Which fragmentation drivers do you see in action that might compromise the alliance between queer people? And which challenges do we still need to face to give power to this alliance?
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think queer is being very successful in a sense. I think more and more people are using it, and more young people have that sense of queer as this inclusive term that many different people come under. I think one of the big tensions is that a lot of people that we live in a time, certainly in the UK and the US, which I can kind of speak to, of very much a focus on identity. So this idea of trying to figure out who we are at the core and, who our sort of innate self is and what's our identity, especially around gender and sexuality. So queer is kind of taken up in that way of an identity term. And that really is out of odds with its sort of meaning in queer activism and particularly in queer theory, where it was kind of against being an identity term. It's about saying that that we shouldn't be kind of put in these boxes around identity, and that has a particular history which is very problematic, and maybe we should be using queer much more in a kind of relational sense to describe how we relate to each other or in terms of our practices. But what happens is that queer and lots of these other terms around gender and sexuality end up being quite used to police who gets to count, who's queer enough and who isn't, who gets to use these words and who doesn't. And that's, there's a lot of problems with this kind of practice of policing queerness and deciding who gets to be in the group and who doesn't, which, the umbrella that Jules is kind of illustrating at the moment, we used in the book, to say who gets to be under the umbrella and who doesn't. And we see this playing out in these kind of conversations about who gets to march in Pride, for example, and who doesn't. And it's complicated, right? Because in a way, there are problems with just anybody being able to say, hey, I'm queer. And actually, some people have had this, this really long history of pain around queerness and around being cast out and around discrimination and even violence. And so I think I can understand why people who've been through all of that not so comfortable with somebody who's had a pretty normative life just coming along and saying, hey, I'm going to use this word as well. So it's complicated, and I think that we need to sort of hold those tensions. I think that gets to the second part of your question, but I can't quite remember what the third part was now. Can you just remind me?
Yeah, of course. Which challenges do we still need to face to give power to this alliance?
Yeah, I think the big challenge is that thinking about how to be inclusive across all kind of intersections, particularly differences in generation. So when you've got people who use very different language and have very different meanings, how to include all of that in one space. So for example, with trans, you've got a lot of people say, well, trans is the encompassing word, but some people still use transsexual, certainly transgender. Some people would even use tranny as a reclaimed term. How do we create a space, that's welcoming for all of that, rather than having this kind of policing of language? And how do we again include everyone, but also have that sense that some people have had a much more difficult time than others, or have been much more marginalized than others, and recognize those kind of power imbalances as well, and the different life experiences that people have had. Again, how do we recognize that for some, queer may have been a term of abuse and be a very uncomfortable term. For others, it's incredibly celebratory term. I think that's the real difficulty, and where people often go on social media is to start policing which terms are okay and which aren't, who gets to use them, who doesn't, who gets to be in and who gets to be out, what behaviours are sort of over the line, and then we kind of get rid of people entirely from the community. And the real challenge is, how can we be compassionate and inclusive across such difference? Does that make sense?
No, just like while you were talking about the term queer, one of the things is like when you talk, especially how abusive it feels for some people, definitely it has a different history in Italy. Like when we translated it, we also pointed that out, because it's not an abusive term here, as it doesn't have this past history. It's just being kind of like...
Oh, it doesn't?
Queer comes from English, and we use it as a term, which then I would enter in the discussion of what it means and how it is used, but definitely it doesn't have this part, because before it came from US and English language anyway, it wasn't here. So like we have other derogatory terms, but not necessarily queer. So it has just a more empowering feel, I would say, mostly.
It's largely the same in Germany, where I'm from as well. Like queer is not used as a derogatory term there either, and it's more like English word that we've adopted. Like gender, we don't actually have different words for sex or gender in German, so you just use the English gender now for what we understand as gender, as opposed to sex. So, yeah.
And do you have other kind of terms that were abusive that have been reclaimed in the same way as queer, or do you just kind of take queer? I think
we do have some in Italian, like we have our own, like I would say, abusive terms that we take and reclaimed with time. So of course, like in the history of gay history or like LGBT movement history, there are this reclaiming practice is also active here, of course. Just with that work with queer. But,
and do you think that the things that I was saying about the sort of tensions and challenges, is that similar? Would you say those are similar in an Italian context, or would you say they're different?
About the challenges in Italy, because I didn't hear the question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering, if the same things that I've said about the challenges, are they similar in Italy, or are they different? with the...
Well, in Italy, sometimes the word queer is used to like, for example, to be inclusive of all identities, but not everybody recognize themselves in the word queer. And the fact that queer is an English word sometimes is used by, for example, institutions to organize things about LGBTQ issues without talking about lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, and queer people, because it's an English word, so not everybody knows the meaning of that word.
That the word queer, like, I have the feeling that is used also here, like Bea was saying before, as an inclusive term, but then sometimes in some context, I personally heard that it's a way of flattening all the identities into one. So it kind of erases the difference. This is something that I think it is in common with what you were saying before. And yeah, this is, I mean, I have a vague idea, but like, I think this is a bit, sometimes it happens.
That's a really good point. Yeah, if we use it as this term for LGBT, and then those, those are not level, because sort of certainly, with the sort of problems of bi-invisibility and a huge amount of transphobia, it's not that LGBT people are all treated the same within wider culture. So there is that risk, isn't there? Yeah, if you use the Q as an encompassing term, and then the question of, are we even encompassing asexual people in there? And what about intersex people? What about some of the other different sexualities and relationship styles? Are they in there or not? And again, they're treated differently, aren't they? Yeah, that's a really good point.
And yeah, then we have more questions. So, like in the book, it is you clearly narrate how the term queer, like how the queer movement at its origins had a strong radical, subversive, defiant drive. It is very clear along the book that there's not only one queer theory or movement, but a bit like Teresa de Lauretis says at the onset of the queer movement, that she talks about how it changed immediately. Do you also see queer shifting towards a more mainstream direction, as well as towards being more academic and inaccessible? Or in your experience and opinion, does it still have this oppositional and radical power?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I suppose my preferred understanding of queer is to question normativity in general, like not just sort of heteronormativity of the idea that people should be in heterosexual relationships, but generally that the whole normative way of doing life, that people should have these certain aims in life which are very tied in with a kind of white neoliberal capitalist kind of model of what makes a successful life. And I would see that as, it's really bound up in the kind of huge injustices we see in the world today, and also, the way we treat the planet, and, we can't disentangle it from all that. So I think that the radical meaning of queer is, we need to question the way we relate with each other and the way we relate with ourselves and the planet, because the kind of normative version we have of how we should do all of those things is really unjust, it's really violent. It involves treating some people as valuable and some people as disposable, and so on. And I think, the pandemic has really highlighted a lot of that for us. So that's the radical potential of queer. It's saying, like, how do we relate with each other and ourselves and the world? And we must, just throw out all of these things that we're given about how we should do it, that we should buy property and that we should settle down in couples and have families in a particular way, treat children a particular way. So it's way beyond sexuality, really, is where it could take us. And certainly the early academic forms of queer theory were very tied in with racial injustice as well. That's what they were pointing out, as much as kind of gender injustice and sexuality injustice. And as we say in the book, that kind of got whitewashed out. Then there's not much about class in there either in queer theory. Some people have tried to bring that in more. So yeah. And the other piece is, that when it gets taken up in academia, it does go in some very abstract places and with a lot of very big words. And that was part of our aim in really writing this as a comic book, was to try and bring some of those ideas back to everyday queer people and just everyone in a way that they might be able to understand, because they might struggle to pick up some of those more academic queer texts.
But pop culture, theory, practices, struggles, daily experience of empowerment and oppression, all of this is bound together in a consistent narration of what queer is in your graphic history. And so this is connected to what you were saying before. How did the choice of matching the history and practices of queer with the illustration came to mind? And how do you think this approach might help people to understand the different meanings and nuances of what queer actually means? And then a bit about, for Jules in particular, how difficult it was to create the drawings for these notions and concepts.
Right.
Shall I give a bit of history? Do you want to start, Jules, or shall I give a bit of the history while you're drawing, or what would you?
You go first. I'll come in.
Okay, so the reason we did the book was primarily because Icon Books, they publish a whole series of graphic guides to various topics, feminism, Marxism, this kind of thing, Freud, Einstein, so across sciences, social sciences, and they wanted to do an introducing queer theory book. So they're always academic ideas. And so they came to me with that, and then they wanted an illustrator who would, fit well with the material. So got to Jules that way. But as we were kind of writing the book, we realised it could be quite a lot more than just an introduction to queer theory for, say, students. That it could be something that might be much more helpful to just generally people who are questioning, say, their sexuality and gender themselves, or wondering about the word queer, in a more activist or community context. And so, we tried to make the book quite a lot more inclusive and not just focused on the academic theory, but also the activism, and also just these questions of how do we be queer, and what does being queer mean, and how do we relate queerly? And I think as it went on, Icon decided, we're going to release this in a much more glossy format, like it looked like a graphic novel, rather than the quite small little format that they had for the introducing guide. So it became something really bigger than what it was originally planned, and much more about kind of getting these ideas out as widely as possible. And I think that, comic books and zines and graphic novels, they're a brilliant format for this, because a lot of people will read them who don't read a textbook.
Yep. Okay, sorry. Our editor Kira approached me after a zine fair, because I've been self-publishing. I've been making my own kind of zines and comics for a while, and a lot of them were themed around queerness. And basically that's how I got involved in the project. And it was very exciting for me, because I think at the time when we were working on it, there was a lot of things that I was very new to, that I was learning as well. So for me, it was really that perfect kind of project where I was very personally invested in it. And I'm also a really strong believer of graphic nonfiction. Again, for me personally, I learn better with a mix of words and pictures, and I know a lot of people learn that way. And I think we're now kind of understanding a bit more that this is not like, not all picture books are necessarily for children, and this is a really good way to read about complex theories. And like queer theory is very complex. Like one thing we always talk about is that we never managed to finish a Judith Butler book, and I think especially to have something that's easily accessible, where I can draw people who are experiencing the theory, as well as it just being theory written down. So you have like a bit of a human touch to it. It's very practical, I think, especially for younger people who want to talk to their parents about this stuff, or older generations who maybe have not had the same education culturally or, through school. So, basically it's just been really good to see that people kind of give this book to their parents for a way that it's like an easy way in for them to understand the basics of queer identity and also very good for people like me who at the time I was still figuring things out as well while we were working on the book. So yeah, it's just been really helpful in that way. If that makes sense.
Well, I never thought about giving this book to my mom, but I
thought about it because it may be easy for understand a bit.
Okay.
But yeah.
You had to draw many queer characters for this book, and you succeeded in avoiding consolidated stereotypes that are generally associated with queer people in mainstream media. What were your concerns in this respect? How did you graphically develop your characters? And where did you get inspiration, or if you have any model in mind for your work?
I mean, basically, a big part of it is drawing the people I know in my queer community, you know, and I think that was really important to me to kind of have a reflection of queer people living their lives now. And yeah, my inspiration came mainly from people in my own life, and also people that I follow on social media, you know, like activists, queer activists, and queer people have more of a platform there. And it's always been really important for me to include all kinds of body types, all kinds of diversity throughout, basically. Yeah, so yeah, basically the short answer to the question is I'm just trying to draw the people that I know and that I see every day in my life and on social media. And MJ has also been really good with this in terms of like when we were talking through the book before we were drawing it, MJ, you were quite focused on including as many diverse body types and as many kind of diverse perspectives as possible as well.
So was Meg-John also participating in this, not in the drawings, but in the idea of what was going to be represented in the drawings?
That's right. It's a great thing about our collaboration because I do draw zines myself as well, and I'm a big comics fan. So it's not quite as simple. And obviously Jules knows quite a bit about these areas, and so does our editor, Kira. So it isn't this three-way collaboration where I do the writing, Jules does the illustration, Kira does the editing. It's much more joined up than that. So yeah, I have quite a lot of ideas around the drawings that I write about. I make suggestions all the way through for Jules. And then Kira also thinks very much about how do the words and pictures work together. So by the time Jules gets it, we've already thought a lot about the illustrations. And then also, as you know, Jules is working through the book, they may make suggestions around the text as well, you know, and how the images and text work together. But also sort of increasingly, as we've written more books in the series, I think Kira and Jules might suggest, you know, have you thought about putting this person in here? Or are you aware of that person's work as well? Because we're all immersed in these communities, and I feel much more comfortable writing like that. It's a proper collaboration. It's not sort of it's not like a conveyor belt, you know, of like I do the writing, Jules does the illustrations, Kira edits it, you know, and we're all kind of fragmented from each other.
Yes.
Okay, so I'd like to go back to one of the topics we were discussing earlier about the risk of erasing the different identities. And in particular, one of the critiques to the word queer has been precisely the fact of invisibilizing structural power relationships and the experience of lived by the identities included in this umbrella term. For instance, a Black lesbian trans woman living in Italy experiences several grounds of oppression like racism, lesbophobia, transphobia, and sexism at the same time. And those experiences need to be clearly outlined in order for people to self-identify them, to name them, and to gather around them and create alliances. And in this respect, we'd like to focus on what Spivak calls strategic essentialism.
Yeah.
And on the call of Cathy Cohen to engage both on identity and queer politics. So can you share with us some successful examples of these strategies, if you can think about them?
Well, I suppose, yeah, I mean, where your question got me thinking is this theme of intersectionality. And I think that early queer theory, it was intersectional. It was saying pretty much similar things to sort of intersectional feminism. But I think that has got lost sometimes in queer activism and queer theory. So I think that we've done a series of books now, one on gender and one on sexuality, to follow up the queer book. And for us, intersectional feminism is really at the heart of it. So we're drawing on queer theory and queer activism, but also it's always got to be intersectional, and it's always got to have this historical understanding of these systems and structures of power and how they impact, as you say, different people's lived experience. So in the books, we're always trying to get that understanding. And also this sense, I think it comes in the gender book, that we have to almost have, I think Jules illustrated it as a pair of glasses with two lenses. So the sort of personal lens and the political lens, we might say, or the social lens and the more psychological lens. We need to look at everything simultaneously, because a problem within, an awful lot of mainstream culture, and also perhaps in some kind of therapy as well, in some communities, is that we look at life through the personal lens. We say, this is what happened to me, and it was really hard, and we don't look at all those systems and structures that impact on people. I mean, so somebody might say, oh well, I'm trans and you're trans, to that person you just described, so we have a shared experience. We had that shared experience of difference in school or something, and erase all of those other intersections there, and all of the interlocking kind of systems and structures of power. But the problem, it is a problem also if we cover that lens up and only look at the world through the kind of social justice lens or the political lens, because then we may not see other aspects of a person's lived experience that might be coming into play. And so I think in our work increasingly over the series, we've had that model of like, how can we hold somebody's personal lived experience through their life at the same time as holding all of these systems and structures of power? And that's kind of an idea that I'd like to sort of shine through the books. And it's certainly going to be very present in the next book that we're doing on mental health, because mental health is often seen just as an individual, personal thing, but we also have to see it as an experience that we have under oppression and under kind of societal violence. Does that answer the question?
Yes, absolutely. And I guess we have one more question. Which is actually connected to what you were saying just before about the two other books you have written together.
Yeah,
which I've read, and they are really, really great. Actually, I enjoyed them very much. And so you work together on the other two books, which are, as you were saying, gender and sexuality. And so the three books represent a complex narrative architecture that encompasses most of the themes that concern gender identity, sexual orientation, and the bodies that we live. And the question is, how do you see a continuity in contents and style between these three books? And would you consider them as three parts of the same reasoning? And this question goes to both of you, of course.
Thanks. Did you want to start, Jules, for this one?
Yeah, I think we definitely look at the books as a trilogy, which has been quite good, actually, because I think one of the things with queer was that it had to be quite general, just in terms of like fitting as much as possible around all these different identities, practices, histories into one book. And I think, especially now with the kind of talk about gender in the media and everything at all around it, it's been really important to look at gender in a more kind of in a more focused way, and to have an entire book about that. And the same with sexuality. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And for me, again, this sort of sense that the queer book, we just couldn't do as much on gender and sexuality specifically as we wanted to. But I more saw it as like, with the queer book, we started something, you know, and as we wrote the book, we realized, this is what this could be. You know, it could be in this kind of more glossy format, and, you know, it could maybe appeal to quite a wide market of people. And then, you know, that just left me like, I really want to keep doing this kind of book, because I think it could be really helpful to people, and get away from that sense, really, even of it being about a particular academic theory at all, but like all of these intersecting sort of axes that we're talking about could really do with a whole kind of graphic guide, unpacking them and helping people understand them. So I think they are planning to do one on class, and I'm certainly hoping they'll do like race and disability as well. And as I say, we've done gender, sexuality, but while those do work really well as a trilogy, queer, gender and sexuality, because queer has been a lot about gender and sexuality, I think, you know, we also need to do those that cover those other intersections in the same way, because they intersect just as much, you know, with gender and sexuality. And also, I think mental health and love and relationships is the other one that I'd like to do. Those topics as well completely intersect with gender and sexuality in terms of how people are treated. And again, I don't know that there's much out there for people that gives a kind of intersectional understanding of mental health or of relationships, again, in a way that hopefully is quite accessible to a number of people. So yeah, I'm really hoping that you might think about translating the gender and sexuality ones into Italian as well. And I suppose the other thing to say in there is that I do this other series of books with Alexi and Taffy, which are more of a self-help guide to the same topics. So we've covered gender and sexuality now, and we're going to do one on relationships. And Alex is Italian. So we're really hoping that you might at some point, or somebody might at some point, translate those ones into Italian too, because there's a bit of a sense that the illustrated guides, the graphic guides, give the information, you know, this is what's going on here, but the ones that I do with Alex are much more personal. Like if somebody wants to explore their own gender or their own sexuality or their own relationships, they'd be a really good place to go. So the books work quite nicely alongside each other, those two series.
Well, we will be glad to translate them, of course.
Yes, please. Alex would be the happiest person in the world if their books got translated into Italian, so that their family and friends back home would be able to read them. You know.
Yeah. I can't wait to read the one on mental health, actually, because I guess it's true that it's an issue that is generally overlooked, or there is so much stigma going on still on these topics. And
actually, I was wondering about, if I can ask about the one you're thinking about on mental health, if it's going to be like specifically from a queer perspective, or if it's going to encompass more topics like, you know, face the stigma, or like about what is it going to go, more or less, because in this specific moment it's quite relevant also to start considering health and mental health after the experience we had with the pandemic. So it would be nice to know a bit more about it.
Yes, I mean, I think it's really prompted for me by experiencing, you know, trauma very much during this period as well. I've always been I was a therapist for many years, so I've always written and talked about mental health a lot, but it's become, you know, even more personally relevant in the last year or two. So, and I felt like, again, there's not much out there that brings all of the understandings of mental health together. So yeah, it's not particularly a queer book, but it is taking an intersectional and kind of social justice understanding of mental health in there. So it's not just a kind of individual mental health, like what are the different therapies and how do they work. It's got that in, but it also has this, why are some people much more impacted than others because of injustice, because some lives are treated as more valuable than others. That's got to be in there as well. And every level we're going to sort of try and swoop it. We're starting with the kind of existential level of the kind of theories around human suffering and why it's just hard to be a human and relate with other humans on this planet, kind of thing. And then kind of look into that cultural level of social injustice and how that impacts different people differently. Then into the interrelational level of how our relationships growing up are a big part of how we end up with mental health struggles or like kind of alienated from ourselves, for example. And then also all the way into the body, and all this kind of trauma literature which understands how the nervous system works, so that's quite important when we're kind of looking at helping people with their mental health, is to understand how this all works at an embodied level and what practices can help to calm the nervous system, for example. So we're starting, I kind of imagine it, we're using a superhero kind of theme. So I kind of imagine it as like this, kind of superhero sort of looking at the whole planet, like, and then zooming into kind of the different contexts and cultural contexts, and then zooming into the interrelations between people, and then zooming right inside the body, and then kind of doing the same process outwards, of what can we do then? What can we do on an embodied level when we're struggling with our mental health? What can we do on a relational level? What can we do in our communities and our cultures? What systems and structures are needed to change? And then what can we do on this existential level, again, when we're facing these existential threats in terms of pandemics and climate crisis? How do we deal with all of that? So that's at the moment my thinking, and I'm planning to write the book the rest of this year, hopefully, and get Jules who gets illustrating sort of early next year, maybe.
Okay.
I think we can conclude. Or
maybe they have questions for us.
Yeah, unless you have questions or...
Oh, I do. I've got so many questions for you. I'd love to hear more about the experience of translating the book. So I was in Barcelona a year or two ago, and I got to meet, a couple of the Spanish translators of one of Queer and one of my other books. And it was incredibly moving experience to realize, like, these are the two people who had sat with these words almost as long as I had, or maybe even longer than I had, and it meant a lot to them. They were very engaged with the topics, and it feels like you also, it's not the case that the publisher's just given some random translators this book and all you're doing is just translating the words. It feels like you're much more engaged with the topic of the book. So I'd just love to hear a bit more about your experience of doing the translation and what that's like.
Yes. Yes, we are. The three of us, we are. I don't know if I can talk about them, but for them, but I guess that we are actually really engaged in the issue. We are trans feminist activists and queer people in life. So, of course, it's not about translating something that has nothing to do with our lives. So, of course, it was really, really interesting. I have to admit that I learned a lot of things I didn't know about queer theory. And yes, I found it really easy to understand what you were trying to communicating, also thanks to the illustrations, of course. As per the translation, we had to discuss a lot of things because when you translate, you have to make some decisions, especially when it comes to English words that are often used in Italy in English. They don't have a proper translation. So in those cases, you have to decide whether to keep the English word or translate it, even if the meaning is not exactly the same, or invent a new word, even though you know that this word is not actually used in your community. So this was, in my opinion, the most difficult thing of the translation, and we had to discuss these issues together. Maybe they are going to give you some more details on which specific words, but the point I wanted to stress is that discussing the translation was a queer moment. I mean, we were there together discussing, each one with his own or their own experience. We come from different parts of Italy, and we actually live in Rome and in the UK, and so we have different backgrounds, more or less. So it was really interesting to translate it. Actually, it was a kind of political meeting all the time.
Yeah, an example that I would like to give is, for example, with the word dyke, because we don't have an Italian translation for that. And also in Italian, lesbian is used as a derogatory term.
Oh.
And so this is one of the examples. So, for example, queer as well, we thought about what should we do, and we decided from the beginning to keep the English word because in some contexts it is used, not in the streets, but in some contexts like the movements or the academic word is used. And I come from the academic world. And it was really, really interesting to read the book. And I also learned a lot of things. So thank you very much. And the fact of using this kind of drawings, I think it's going to be really, really helpful for a lot of people here in Italy as well to understand what queer means and how it can be used in a very political also way. Not just as an identity or just as something that is promoted by the publishing, the commerciale, mainstream and reality.
I mean, I think that they just said basically everything. Like, I just liked what as Marta said before. No, it's basically has been like a constant political meeting online, of course, because we were in different parts,
countries, actually.
Different countries. So it's kind of like quite a challenging discussion, especially as we were saying for the terms and everything, because there's so much we borrow from English, so much we borrow from. Mostly English actually. So that's also the relation of the language. Because like this kind of like English being everywhere and like kind of positioning ourselves in relation to how to use English, how much to use it. Because it's also a way of kind of reclaiming the words in our language. But sometimes, as Bea said, like some words don't exist. So it's a bit. It's a lot of working around it.
It's a balance. It's a kind of choosing the correct balance between using the right words and being aware that using Italian conveys concepts that are much more closer to our real life. Because using English conveys like a feeling of detachment from what you're talking about, and we are actually translating and talking about issues that are really, really connected to our material lives and also ideals and also political positionings. So, and I just wanted to add another issue we had to face concerning our white privilege, actually. And we decided, for example, not to translate of color because in our opinion, I mean, it goes beyond being Black, but of color. There is a precise translation into Italian, of course, but it is, I mean, we perceived and we asked also, and it is not used and not reclaimed by racialized people in Italy. So we decided to just leave it in English because we didn't want to invent a representing word for an identity that we do not live. So it was this kind of political choices we had to make while translating the book. I don't know if we replied to your question.
Oh, so well. I'm really grateful to you, because it's really important that, I guess, translators go beyond just turning it into the language. You know, these questions are so vital. It's like, I think for me, something about writing these books is trying to wrestle it to some extent away from a kind of US centric, you know, there's a lot of, in these areas, kind of the research and the theory and the activism often gets very kind of US centric, and I've been trying to bring in a bit more of a European flavor, but for me that's inevitably going to be more UK than the rest of Europe, because that's the kind of thinkers and activists that I know. So again, I'm really aware, particularly talking to some of my colleagues like Daniel Cardoso from Portugal, who's in some of these books, you know, that's you know, a lot of their work isn't even recognized in a UK context because it's in Portuguese, and there's just, you know, there's so many thinkers who aren't even being read, you know, in a UK and a US context. So it's kind of, really thinking about all of those power dynamics, and I guess there's an act of trust in a way that translators will engage this politically and will really think, okay, what does it mean to leave this in English? Like that has a political ramification, or what does it mean to translate this? And certainly if language is not, you know, I'm so interested that the point about if of color is not used in Italy, then it would be a real problem to kind of translate that as if it was neutral, or if, you know, if lesbian is a term of insult, again, then that's going to have a really different flavor if that's translated in the book. It's going to land differently than how it would land with an English audience, right? So I think I see this sort of as this real big collaboration, that every time the books get translated, it's then a collaboration with those translators to kind of translate the soul of the book, I guess, as well, to keep it in that kind of the sort of ethics of what we're trying to do. Thank you. Thank you for what you've done.
Thank you for this interesting question and for being with us today, despite all inconveniences we had. We actually made it. You want to say something? You're looking at me. Okay. And of course, thank you, Jules, for this wonderful drawing. And it was really nice watching you drawing while we were talking, and the queer umbrella. And so it's where we started this conversation. And yes, we really hope to have you in Italy one day, maybe. For the next translations, maybe the other two books will be released at that time. And so thank you again, and have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.